Okay, so welcome to today's workshop for TritonHacks. We're going to be covering the basics of HTML and CSS, which are the two coding languages you're going to be using for any web development. And we're going to try to make this as beginner-friendly as possible. So if you have any coding experience, that's great, but none is required for this. So the first thing we need to understand is the structure of a web page and how everything interacts with one another. So it essentially breaks down into HTML documents, which are these individual files with an HTML extension. And each one of these files is going to define the structure and the behavior of elements on a single page. And when we have multiple of them, we can link them together to jump back and forth between pages on the same website. So now behind the scenes, we want to understand a little bit more about how the functionality works. So when the user is on a web page, they can interact with it by scrolling, clicking buttons, or a lot of other things. And that's going to send some kind of signal to the backend and all of the code we've written. So once that happens, it's going to be used to retrieve some kind of data or perform calculations typically, and it's going to output some kind of value. And then once that happens, the value is going to be passed to the front end or everything that we see on the computer. And then it's going to update the web page for the user using that. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and it's a coding language that uses these tags to define its elements and structure everything in a very easy to read way where we can modify it however we need. So when we want to use tags, we have two options. The first option is in pairs of an opening and a closing tag, where the closing tag has this extra backslash, but they both contain the name of the element. And then when we have these pairs of tags, we can put some kind of content within the tags. And this content can be a string, or it could be another element if we want to nest something within it. And then the second type of tag is a self-closing tag, like for the image one we see at the bottom. And we use these because sometimes it doesn't make sense to have the content inside a pair of tags. And instead, all we need is these attributes or the text highlighted in purple to define the behavior of the element. So for an image, all we need is the location of the file that we want to display. And then we can also share the width and the height if we want to force it to be a specific dimension. So when we're writing an HTML document, these certain elements are required, and it's easier if you just memorize them. So the first one is the exclamation point doc type HTML, and we put this at the top of every file just to state that we're working with an HTML document. And then the next element is the HTML tag, and it comes in an opening and closing tag pair. And that's going to be the root element of everything on the website. So everything else is going to be within it. And then the next tag we see is the head tag, and that contains all of the metadata about the website, which is stuff that isn't going to be displayed on it, like how the standard content is, but it's stuff like the title of the web page or the logo next to that title, or maybe like the character set for our text. And then in the body tag, that's going to be mostly everything else that the user sees and all of the elements like images, paragraphs, and headers. So the first type of tag we want to understand is how to use text tags. So we have two main categories. So the first one is headers, and we have 6 tags for these, H1 all the way up to H6, where the H1 tag is the biggest size header and H6 is the smallest size. However, all you really need to remember is H1 because we're going to learn how to change the font size ourselves later. And then the other option is the P tag for paragraphs. So the next type of tag is the div tag, and it actually doesn't display anything, but it is a divider or like a container for other elements. So we're going to learn about classes and IDs later, but when we apply a class name or an ID to an element, we can reference it later. And when we put one of these on a div tag, we can use it to reference the entire group of elements contained within it. So we can style it or apply other traits to all of them in an easier way. So next is the image tag. And like we showed before, it's self-closing. So the only required attribute is the source, where we pass in the path of the file that we want to display. The width and height are optional if we want to force the dimensions to be some specific value, and then we could also pass an alternative attribute to display some text if the image fails to load. Next is the A tag, and it's used to define hyperlinks, which are links on a web page to another location. So we have 3 examples here where within the 2 tags, we have the text that it's going to display, and then using the href attribute, it tells it where to go when you click on that text. So we could go to a different file on the same web page. We could go to a completely separate web page, or we could just scroll down to a specific element on the page. So now if we actually want to write and run our code, we are going to have to use a text editor to write it, or if you have a code editor, that's even better because it's going to offer a lot of shortcuts. So Visual Studio Code, Sublime, and Atom are really good, but anything works. And then this is going to be the code we're going to write, which is basically like the simplest website we could build. That's just going to write hello world in the header. And we're just going to go through this really quick on a Mac. So if you have a code editor like this, we could just save our file and give it a name first with an HTML extension. And then one reason to use a code editor is shortcuts like this, where it gives you a lot of the standard templates that you're going to need, and we can delete these. And then if we just name it my first website, which is going to show up in the browser's header area, and then we just put an H1 that says hello world. We can actually run this really quick if we just open it in Chrome, and we'll see that we get the text. So if you don't have a code editor yet, you can actually just do this in any text editor, where we just make a new file, and then we're going to want to make it plain text so the computer doesn't try to format it with anything extra. And then if we save this as another file, we're going to see that it gives us the same output. Yeah, so that's the first part, and then Lexi's going to cover CSS.
So next we're going to be talking about CSS, and CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And this means that CSS can describe how HTML elements are going to be displayed on the screen. So CSS can actually save us a lot of work because it can control the layout of multiple web pages all at once. But we do have to keep in mind that CSS cannot function alone to create a website. So we do have three different terms when describing our styles. So we have CSS rule, CSS selector, and CSS declaration. And we want to also keep in mind the syntax for the CSS. We have something called a selector. So that could actually be like, for example, an H1 element, which stands for the header. We can have a property which can be the color of said header, and then we can even have a value, and we can set color to something like blue, red, or green, and so on. And so basically every style is defined by a selector and a declaration. And the declaration can contain at least one property, value, or pair, and together they form a CSS rule. However, we can actually add multiple CSS declarations, and they can be separated with semicolons. We're going to talk about CSS selectors. And what CSS selectors allow us to do is to basically find the HTML elements that we want to style. For example, on the side over here, we have body, paragraph, the header tags, and the A element. So first, so for instance, the first selector, body, we can use it to style every single element on the page because body is the parent of every visible element. So we can even, it doesn't have to be limited to just the font. We can change the background color, we can change even the size of the font, and so on and so on. So some common properties we can use to style our elements are, well, font family, font size, color, margin, padding, border, and background color. These are only just some of the few that we can use. There are definitely more, and they're just a quick Google search away from whatever you're looking for to style your web page. Now let's take a look at IDs versus classes. So in HTML, we can actually give an element a name to reference it, and we can do this in two ways. We can use IDs for when we need to reference a single element of the page, and then we can also use classes to reference all the elements of a certain type. Since IDs can describe a single element, they have to be unique. No two IDs can be the same, otherwise it's just not going to work when you're trying to reference it back in your CSS page. Elements can share the class name with others though. So when we're deciding when we want to use an ID or a class, we do have to keep in mind that the ID of an element is unique within the page. So the ID selector is used to select one unique element. So here we have the ID container 3, right? And when we want to reference it in our CSS page, we have to use the hashtag in front of it. And of course, it's unique to this H1 element. So looking at this example right here, when we want to use a class to style a group of elements, the class name doesn't have to be unique since of course we're using it for a group of elements. So we can have container here for this divider, and then again we can use it again here for the second divider with the H1 element, right? And then so when we're referencing, so again it's important when we're referencing a class name, we do have to add this period in front. So we want to keep in mind the difference between using the hashtag and using the period in front of a class or an ID name. So if we're using an external style sheet, it's very important that we connect it to the HTML file, and we're going to basically be using this line of code right here, and we want to add it to the head tag section of our HTML file. Otherwise, all our work that we do on that CSS file isn't going to show up on our web page. So if you added this line of code and you're still running into an issue where your web page looks the same and nothing has really updated, from your style sheet, then you want to make sure that the file name is spelled correctly, that you have the .css extension at the end of it, and not something like .css.text, otherwise it's just not going to work. You want to make sure that your file is in the correct directory. Make sure you look for any typos when you are adding this line of code, and make sure that the link tag is inside of the head tag too. So let's take a quick look at an example on how we would use a style sheet. So I have my style sheet right here, right? And I already have something. I have for the header, we can change the background color of it. So if I already have that saved and I press the HTML page, you can see that nothing happens, and this is because we didn't link the HTML page and the CSS pages together. So in the head section, I'm gonna add this here, and then if I click on our HTML page, it should show that now we have this background color for the H1 element. But we can go even further than that. We can say, okay, maybe for the body, we want to do background color, and we want something like maybe coral, and we save it. And then if we open it up, so now we have our entire background that color. And we can even do more than this. We can change the font. So we can go font size. We want it, you can, there's some of these presets here, but if you have something, a specific size in mind, you can do 48 pixels. Save it, refresh the page, and then now it's even bigger, right? And then we can add more elements. We can do the paragraph, because right here we have the paragraph tag. We can do font size. We can do maybe 28 pixels. And then let's say we want to change the color of it. We can do color. And then we can change it maybe blue. Refresh the page. And then now we were able to change everything using CSS style sheets. So there are more ways to change it than just size, color, background. If you go to like this website, w3schools.com, there's like all kinds of different things that you can look up to style your CSS pages. And yeah, so now we're going to be going over the project that you guys will be trying out.
All right, so to solidify your understanding of HTML and CSS, you're going to be making a small tribute page project, and it should be really easy for you to implement it based on what you've learned so far. You have user stories, and you just basically follow this tutorial and implement your project. You can use CodePen, which would be really easy. You don't worry about JavaScript. So all you do is write HTML in this block and CSS in this block, and it compiles and runs it. And then once you're done, and if you followed all the user stories correctly, you can run a bunch of tests, and it will tell you if you failed or passed, or if there are any issues with your website. This is what a final project would look like. And again, the design is up to you. You don't have to follow this font pattern or the color pattern, but it should look something close to this. So yeah, hope you guys enjoy the project, and hopefully you enjoyed this little workshop.